Well, welcome back, leaders. We are excited to jump into lesson 5 in chapter 4 with you guys. We love hearing feedback from you guys, and you have spoken and we have heard you. We've made some halftime corrections. We will never do another leader video without answering every single interpretive question. So the feedback has been clear and we have made the corrections, but we're grateful to do these, grateful to get to serve alongside of you guys, and hope that your groups are going well. Well, we're going to be in the second half of Ephesians starting today with Ephesians 4. And so as we jump into the second half of the book, there's really a giant transition at this point in the book. So the first 3 chapters, chapters 1 to 3, really kind of hit key doctrine, key truths, and chapters 4 to 6 are going to really kind of be a transition as we now look at key decrees or conduct. How are we therefore to live?
Yeah. So good. Ephesians is an excellent book. If this is one of the first times you've led a group and helped people see the flow of thought, once again, as we've been talking about. We're going to jump right in and talk about our observation section. One of the things that we've tried to do at the top is to just remind people that these skills are cumulative, so that you should always be underlining and circling and highlighting. And especially as we get into the second half of the book, I think underlining the verbs and the commands is going to be an important thing to remember. Also this week, our observation skill is part 2 of boxing connecting words. Again, in this section, it will really help with the flow. Almost every paragraph starts with a key connecting word that either sets you up for the why he's saying it, for a result, the cause of something. So as you're going through your observations this week, try to call those out in your group.
It's a really easy one in chapter 4. You get a couple therefores where you got to ask the question, what's the therefore? You get a but that kind of highlights the contrast, and then you get an as a result within this section. So it's a really easy one to kind of highlight those connecting words and ultimately kind of keep tracing the flow of thought as we kind of go from one passage to the other.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I loved in kind of some of the opening themes of this section in chapter 4 was just kind of both the emphasis of unity within the section, but also the emphasis on diversity. That you see those themes kind of playing together throughout this, thinking about spiritual gifts, thinking about the unity of the body. And so you kind of see those roles or those themes kind of woven throughout this section as we jump in.
Yeah, definitely. I think repeated words are another big observation, the one, the calling. So some of those things are real softballs for your group to be able to really see what Paul's digging into in this section.
Well, let's kind of jump into the interpretation section. Kind of question 1, we kind of addressed it a little bit already, but just as a reminder that therefore kind of helps create a bridge between chapters 1 and 3 and chapters 4 and 6. Chapters 1 and 3, again, being kind of doctrine, and chapters 4 to 6 being kind of duties, kind of how are we going to walk the conduct. One of the things that I kind of saw too was, and it says chapters 1 and 3 you could refer to as kind of our heavenly calling, and then chapters 4 to 6 you could kind of see as our earthly conduct. So you kind of see these two, and chapter 4 verse 1 as that bridge between these two main sections.
Yeah, definitely. Almost like if these things are true, then what does it look like to live it out? Excellent. Okay, so then question number 2, what does it mean to walk worthy of this calling? So why does Paul use the word walk? What does it mean? So if you did a little word study on that, you might have seen that it is peripateo. It actually could also be translated as live. So it kind of has this idea of progress, but then progress in your life, how you regulate your life, how you conduct yourself. I saw that it also was a callback to our famous verse, Ephesians 2:10, that we were created as his workmanship, his masterpiece, so that we could walk in the good works that he has prepared beforehand. It's an important kind of concept, the outward expression of the inward life.
And even in kind of as you trace that word, you're going to see it not just here in the early part of 4, but you're going to see it later part of 4. You're going to see it even multiple times in chapter 5. And so you see it in with a couple different thrusts really throughout. Here in the early part of 4, what we kind of see is this idea of a call toward humility that allows for both unity and diversity, that we're supposed to keep the bond of unity, but we're also supposed to serve in humility alongside of one another in the midst of our own different gifts and whatnot. Later on in chapter 4, we're going to see that it's kind of that we're supposed to walk and live in conduct that's different than the Gentiles. In chapter 5, we're to live with a conduct that's characterized by love. Middle part of 5, the idea that we're to live and to kind of have conduct that's likened to those that are in the light versus those that were formerly in the darkness. And then the latter part of 5, that we're to walk, to live in such a manner that's characterized by wisdom and not by foolishness. And so you're going to see this word throughout chapters 4 and 5. And really that kind of theme of conduct, how are we to live lifestyle throughout the second half of the book. And we're going to see it in different ways and different themes and different emphases throughout.
Yeah, so good. Okay, so then question 3, why does Paul emphasize some of the characteristics of this walk to be love, unity, and peace? I just loved verses 2 through 6, where you get what I saw one commentator call Paul's messianic Shema. So the prayer of the people of God was in Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. That was a huge concept. Even Jews to this day pray the Shema every day. But this is Paul, where he's repeating 7 times the word one. And that might be something that you would actually want to do as you're discussing question 3, going back to actually identifying what does Paul mean by one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith. I think you can dig out a lot that then contributes to the idea of why it's so critical for this band of new brothers and sisters to live in this way with peace, unity, and love. Remember the historic context of this is that we have groups of people who may have never really socialized together before. Jews and Gentiles, men and women, slaves and free men. So they're having to learn actually how to be together in a room. And so with unity as being the central calling to then encounter all the things that will come their way, I think that's part of why it was so critical for the Ephesians church. The other question that you might add to this is, why is it critical for the church today to live in or to meet in love, unity, and peace? To just bring it up to our context as well.
I love that. Question 4 kind of gets into the topic of spiritual gifts, which is a huge part of kind of the back half of this passage. And so we kind of reference not just this passage, but we also wanted to pull in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, kind of the 2 other key passages on spiritual gifts to kind of help round out the discussion on that topic. And so kind of wanted to highlight a few things there. So what spiritual gifts are particularly mentioned in the New Testament? Clearly here in Ephesians 4, the emphasis is on Christ giving gifts of particular gifted people here in Ephesians 4. And so what you're going to see is a reference of apostles, of prophets, of evangelists and pastors and teachers. And so kind of walk through those just a little bit briefly. Apostles often refer to those that had seen Jesus Christ personally. And so in the last passage, the last lesson, there was the questions on apostle in terms of who Jesus or Paul was. And so apostles were those that had seen the risen Christ, that had a calling to represent and to provide and to preach the gospel wherever they would go. You're going to see some other places throughout the gospels and throughout the epistles where you're going to see apostolic-like work being done, in which the church is being established in contexts that it were not, often by some that hadn't necessarily seen the risen Lord. And so one of the questions we'll get to a little bit here is, do we still have apostles today? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Prophets still also were those that had, in some cases, that were speaking new revelation. They were declaring it for the first time. Sometimes we're going to see the use of prophecy, not necessarily the foretelling of new revelation, but sometimes we're going to see it as those that were exhorting that which had already been revealed to a current audience. And so sometimes we see it in multiple spaces. Also, sometimes prophets were seen as those that were singing or even praying in a gathered service. And so that use of prophecy actually is a little bit more robust and has more varied meaning than often we think about it from kind of a foretelling kind of sense. And then evangelists, often what you think about those that were proclaimed to preach the gospel, and then pastors and teachers, some discussion as to whether that's a combo word describing one kind of group or whether those are 2 different kinds of people. But again, those that were shepherding the church, those that were teaching the gathered church, the truths of the word of God, kind of those ideas of the gifted people. But then as you kind of jump into 1 Corinthians 12, you're going to see it not just necessarily gifted people, but you're going to see it in terms of gifted activities. And so in 1 Corinthians 12, you're going to see wisdom, discernment, knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy again, and even tongues and interpretation. And so in those 2 different passages that were given you, sometimes we're seeing an emphasis on gifted people. sometimes we're seeing an emphasis on gifted activities or functions.
Yeah. And the second half of that, 1 Corinthians 12, it also kind of gives some insight into the how the gifts are used as well, without a spirit of competition, not thinking my gift was better or worse than yours. So read those over and think about them and use them in your discussion. Ask your people, not only what the gifts were, but how they were being used and instructed to be used.
It's really easy to kind of get pulled into some of the minutia and kind of get run away off into some of the topics. And we'll give you even a little fodder for whether these gifts are still active today. But I love the question here, Carolyn, of ultimately, what's the purpose of the gifts? So we can define them, we can identify them, we can get into all the particulars of how they're to be used, but ultimately, what was the primary purpose?
Yeah, it has it right here in our passage, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body. And I love 13 and 14 that just talks about this new humanity that's growing up into maturity, into the fullness of the measure of Christ, so that as a result, we wouldn't be easily swayed by false teaching or doctrines that come our way, that we would be tricked and deceived, but that we would grow up into maturity, I think is an amazing purpose behind them. And once again, it takes the emphasis away from the individual or for the gift or a hierarchy of gifts, but it's all for the building up of the body together.
I love that.
Yeah.
We'll talk about this even a little bit more in application, but just for you leaders thinking about each of your groups, recognizing if they know Jesus Christ, that each of them has been gifted in some form or fashion to whatever extent. And so part of our opportunity as we lead them is to help them find their gifts, learn how to use those gifts, and find in the opportunity of service the joy that comes with just serving the Lord, serving the body. One of the things that we often talk about is that, in a sense, 20% of people are doing 80% of the work. And so how do we help the body of Christ find their gifts and begin to share in that labor and coming alongside of each other for the maturity and the unity of the body?
Yeah, so good, so good.
So one of the questions here, and this is where it is the last two questions really in the interpretation section where you can get lost and spend the next 40 minutes. So I want to try to lay it out for you as simply as possible, but also want to encourage you that a little bit of complexity is great. It leads to great discussion. It leads to an opportunity to use a lot of the Bible study skills we've been teaching throughout the course of the semester. And so I always find complexity is more motivating to utilize the skills than just simplicity. At the same time, for you guys, as you're leading through this week's lesson, you don't want some of the complexity to then kind of hijack the group and to take us way down the road and to lose time for some of the other purposes of the group, or to create division and to create contention in which some of the safety of the group that could be threatened. And so I want to kind of lay these out, give you some flexibility of kind of how we see some of this and kind of walk you through it. So should we expect to see all the gifts in the church today? Why or why not? So where this question typically goes is a couple different directions. One is when it comes to the gifts of healing, miracles, tongues, should we expect to see that today? Should we expect to see secret prayer languages? Should we expect to see tongues in the church? Is God still doing miracles in a way that's supernatural today? How do we answer that? How do we go through that? I'll tell you, there's kind of three different spectrums or three different kind of buckets as to the way people see that. Some would argue from what we would call a cessationist viewpoint, that those gifts were unique in the church age and they are no longer active or existent today. So they'd say, yes, in the early church period, you had tongues, you had miracles, but those are no longer necessary or even active today. There's kind of a middle range that was honestly where we fall as a church that would argue that some of these unique supernatural-like gifts are still present, but they're just not normative. And so even as we think through the scriptures, what we see from Genesis to Revelation is that there are miracles throughout the biblical record, but those those miracles are not necessarily consistently placed throughout the historical timeline. They typically are clumped up around to validate the arrival of new revelation. And so when a prophet comes forward or when an apostle comes forward bringing new revelation to the people of God, that typically those miracles, according to Hebrews 2, are to attest and affirm and validate the message that's being brought. And so here we are in College Station, Texas, with churches My family and I, we attend the Southwood campus on the corner of Welsh and 2018, and literally catty corner across the way is a Baptist church here in College Station. So we literally have churches on every corner. This is an incredibly established context. And so in this context, our elders will still pray for miraculous healing of those that are going through hardship. And so we still pray for healing, but we pray with a bit of a kind of measured expectation that God can do anything. But it isn't as normative here in an established context as we may expect it to be seen and experienced in missionary contexts where the gospel is maybe going out for the first time, where the church is being established for the first time. So for us, we wouldn't hold to a cessationist viewpoint in which they would argue that those gifts are no longer active at all. We would argue that they are active, but they're not normative. So we wouldn't expect to see them necessarily. And particularly when it comes to tongues, I think we kind of get caught up in what are tongues and should they be in the church service or whatnot. And I think 1 Corinthians 14 is an incredibly helpful passage talking about tongues, even as they were understood in the biblical period. And so even in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul will talk a lot about that they were experienced with and alongside of interpretation. That it wasn't necessarily someone's secret prayer language, but it was something that was being done in the presence of the church with a different gifted person who was interpreting what was occurring. And even as 1 Corinthians unfolds and Paul talks even further about it, he highlights a couple things. One, that it was always for the edification of the church, not a person. Also that he has a emphasis and a priority for order over disorder. And so the idea that something would be occurring in a manner that would be kind of hysteric and without interpretation or disorderly isn't at all what Paul intended or imagined with tongues in the early church. And then toward the very end of that, one of the things I love, he talks about, I would rather 10,000 words be spoken with my mind than one or two with a tongue. And so again, he's kind of getting this idea that within the gathered church, there's an expectation of order, there's an expectation of clarity, and that order and clarity is what helps bring edification. And so sometimes even as we talk about tongues, I think 1 Corinthians 14 helps us understand what it was like then and whether that's even occurring today or not. One of the other questions that often comes in this section is, what about apostles? And so sometimes apostles are defined as those that had seen the risen Christ. And so if we hold to that kind of strict definition, well, then clearly we'd say no, that there are people that have seen the risen Christ today and therefore couldn't be functioning as apostles if we're going to hold that strict sense. But if the sense is that the apostles are those that are doing apostolic-like activity or founding the church where it's not established, kind of often in missionary settings, then we would argue and could argue that it could be possible in today's context that the church isn't established in some places, and those that are going to establish it for the first time could be functioning in that kind of way. What would you add?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great summary. And once again, as a leader, I think you take the temperature of your group in terms of this topic and not let maybe the full comprehension of every aspect of spiritual gifts be the main thing. But once again, seeing why Paul is talking about it here, and then for them personally to understand themselves better as a member of the church today.
Yeah, if they walked out at the end of the night with a better sense of their gifts, more so than whether they knew whether every single gift was active today or not, it is a much higher fruit and benefit for the night than just kind of some of that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
And if that wasn't complex enough, then we added a bonus question because we really wanted to give you guys a challenge. And so the bonus question kind of refers a little bit to verses 9 and 10. And so if Christ ascended and gave gifts, then he also descended. And so part of the question becomes, well, what does it mean that he descended? What is this little section talking about? In this section, we're hearkening a little bit back to Psalm 68, which is a victorious psalm in which you have a king who's victorious. He's receiving gifts. And here Paul's talking about Christ who's victorious giving gifts. And so not just receiving gifts, but actually giving gifts to the church itself. And so what's happening here is it's not just that he's ascended, but it's referencing that he's descended. So the question becomes, and many commentators spin, and much ink has been spilt referencing, well, what is it that he descended to? What is this in reference to? So kind of 4 basic ideas or options that are where he could have descended. Some will argue that he descended to the grave, that in death he descended to the lower parts of the earth. He wasn't just the surface of the earth, but he was buried, and trying to reference his burial post-death that preceded his ascending and all the gifts that would come on the backside of his death and resurrection. Some will argue this is a descending into the lower parts of the earth that are referencing Hades, this holding tank that was present and kind of referred to at times in some passages in the Old Testament. Some will refer to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19 as another place that Hades might be referenced in this kind of idea. Thirdly, some will argue, maybe more simply, this is reference to the incarnation, that Christ descended in his incarnation to earth. And then fourthly, some will argue that this was kind of referencing maybe Christ's descension in Pentecost when the Spirit was given. So 4 different ideas. Commentators will kind of bounce between these. I think your 2 best of the 4 is probably the idea of it being either the grave or being incarnation. The idea of Hades or the idea of Pentecost seem less likely, maybe quite strange. I think for Caroline and I, even as we were talking, I think we kind of settled in on thinking particularly it was probably the grave, that in the dissension is speaking of the grave because it's in his crucifixion, his death, and then ultimately his resurrection that we get his victoriousness over sin, death, and Satan. It's not just in the incarnation, but it's particularly in the crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection.
Yeah. And as the conquering king, as we saw in chapter 1, he's ascended and sitting at the top place of the high heavens, then he has the right to give gifts. And so, that's pretty much what we decided on. And then what is the contribution of that section to the this little digression? Just that, once again, Paul just wants to keep beating those drums that, this is in the context where Jesus is Lord, not Caesar, not any other pagan king or Lord, but that he is the victorious king that we serve.
And that his reign, the scope of his reign is from high above the heavens all the way to the lowest parts of the earth. There is no jurisdiction of which his sovereignty can't claim rulership over.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
Well, let's talk application. We gave you guys a couple different directions you could go in application from this section. So kind of for you, where'd you see it going? And
yeah, as usual, I focused on one, Trey focused on the other. We're a good couple here. So I really liked the first one. I think that, in our current culture, we have a lot of division. We have a lot of binary thinking. We have a lot of, being offended easily in our culture. And sometimes that can creep into our relationships in the church. And so I love the idea of just having a conversation in your group about what does it mean to actually keep the unity. The Spirit has given us unity. It's part of the gifting that we have, is to be a unified body with the 7-fold oneness that we have, that we learned about. So what can we do practically as members of a local church, as brothers and sisters, to keep the bond of unity? I think that could be a really interesting conversation.
I love that. The second kind of question we kind of gave you guys an application was, again, back to this topic of spiritual gifts. And so I think one of the reasons why I liked it too is just to make sure that your group doesn't get caught in all the interpretive complexity that might relate to spiritual gifts. I think getting them back practically to, well, what are my gifts? And I think most people love to be self-fascinated. They love all the personality tests from Enneagram to DISC to whatever it may be. And I think giving them an opportunity, maybe even in your group, you can go to our website, you can go to our serve page, and there you can get a link to take you to a spiritual gifts test and let them begin to kind of walk through that and experience that for themselves to kind of get a sense of, what are my gifts? How am I wired? What are some of my unique passions that drive me, that God's provided to me, that are for the benefit of the church and for the benefit of ministry around me?
Yeah. And then we have our Engage tool. Actually, it's a new one this week about sharing your story. The classic sense of that is the story of how you came to find and follow Jesus. There's an easy to follow instructions in the back of the book on page 125. If people in your group have never crafted a simple story of how they came to follow Jesus, I think that would be something really great to talk about. But Trey, you had another idea about how it might tie to this lesson.
Yeah, I was thinking a couple things. One, just even on a night thinking about spiritual gifts, I think it's easy to kind of go for some people, oh, I'm not really an evangelist. That's not my thing. And I was thinking afresh just about Paul's in 2 Timothy talking to Timothy saying, do the work of an evangelist. Thinking even of the Great Commission, that we're all called to share the gospel. We're all called to, in a sense, to then share our story. And so whether you feel incredibly gifted or even passionate about the lost and about sharing your faith, that it's something we're all called to. And so kind of learning how to share your story of your life before before Christ, what you believed when you trusted Christ, and then kind of your life after Christ is a really helpful skill for all of us. But yeah, as Carolyn kind of mentioned, I was thinking about it even a little bit more afresh and a little bit broader, especially on a night that we've been looking and talking about spiritual gifts. It's also an opportunity to think about your story maybe a little bit more broadly. So not just carry out your classic kind of before Christ, what I believed, and then after Christ, but thinking also just more about your life story. And one of the things that I found thinking back on just kind of how God has been using and moving through the course of my life is that there's high moments, there's low moments. Sometimes we'll call them star moments, and there's scar moments. And so even in the heights of those highs and the lows of those lows, that God is often doing something in the midst of those moments that really defines and refines core passions, core desires, core convictions, and that often in some of those moments, as you think about your story, there can be places and they can be the moments that you find what are some unique gifts that the Lord has given you? Or they become the moments that you find your gifts. You find a passion you never knew you had. You find an ability that you never knew you had because you're thrown into a crisis, and all of a sudden something awakens in you as the Spirit of God moves in you. And so I would love to encourage you as you think about your story, or even as you take time over the course of the next few weeks sharing your stories with each other, of kind of thinking back more broadly, not just to how you came to know Christ, but just how has God been moving to shape you? And where might be those moments and those places where he's either affirmed some of your gifts, revealed them to you, or helped you find some passions or some burdens that are particularly to how he wants to use you for his kingdom and for his namesake.
That's great. Well, that's all we have for you. Hope you guys have a great week. Thanks so much.
See ya.